Hey there, you've just found incredible medicine. Hit like and subscribe to discover stories you won't believe.
He woke up to the same dull ache that had shadowed him for months, an ache that sat like a small coin beneath the skin at the back of his neck. It itched in brief pulses and then quieted, the way a misfiring nerve sometimes did after a long day at a desk. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time, a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. He rubbed it at red lights and during phone calls, told himself it felt no larger than a pea, then a grape, then a thumb knuckle. Gradually the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable, until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. He walked into the clinic with the posture of someone apologizing for taking up a slot on the schedule, already rehearsing the casual laughter he used with medical staff when he felt silly about a complaint. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain. He had arrived dripping from a passing shower. The intake nurse measured his blood pressure and the oxygenated calm of his pulse, then pressed a gloved finger against the swelling. He watched her face for a cue that this entire trip would be resolved with a warm compress and a shrug. During the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch. The doctor, an internist with careful hands and a habit of narrating his steps, palpated the area and paused. The mass did not slip away from his fingers like a cyst often did. It seemed to brace itself under pressure, to hold the geometry against the skin. When he lifted his hand, the man felt a small, almost imperceptible recoil, a tautness that suggested the lump knew it had been seen. They moved him to a brighter room. An ultrasound wand traced slow circles through gel across his neck. The monitor displayed shades of storm cloud. The shape inside did not read like a simple fluid pocket. It looked partitioned, faintly lobed, with delicate lines around it as if a spider had sketched a loose frame. The doctor cleared his throat and kept his voice even as he explained the images. A minor surgical procedure was scheduled, thought to be routine. He would come in the next day, not eat after midnight, sign the forms everyone signed. He nodded and folded the consent like a contract with his own relief. He lay under surgical lights that afternoon, the clock's second hand traveling with serene indifference. The anesthetist murmured, and the lids of his eyes lowered as if someone had drawn velvet curtains over a window. The operating room moved around him with the self-assurance of practiced symphony, the hum of machines, the soft metronome of a heart monitor, the clipped syllables of instruments requested and received. But when the first incision was made, the entire operating room froze. Beneath the skin lay an unexpected structure unlike anything they had encountered before. The attending surgeon leaned in. The tissue did not part around a sac. It revealed a pale, resilient lattice, something that had woven itself into the subcutaneous vat the way roots claim soil, not in violent invasion but in patient, deliberate occupation. It did not bleed the way malignancies bled. It sewed itself through tissue with a craft that felt almost architectural. The team worked with extreme care, documenting every step. A scrub nurse lifted a camera with steady hands. A resident narrated landmarks, the curve of the sternocleidomastoid, the shimmer of a small nerve he shielded with gauze. The surgeon traced the structure to its margins, found it curled against a small vessel, and paused again. Nothing moved. No known cyst had such tendrils. No scar tissue bore such regularity. The anesthetist watched the blood pressure like a lighthouse. The surgeon breathed through the stubborn moment, and then began to unbutton the thing from tissue, stitch by stitch. After hours of delicate work, they successfully cleaned the wound and collected samples for testing. He woke in recovery to a cradled ache and the cotton taste of anesthesia. The ceiling tiles offered generic comfort, dots marching to a horizon. A nurse touched his shoulder and smiled. He reached reflexively for the back of his neck and found a bandage, the edges taped and gentle. His throat felt raw from the airway support. When he cleared it, the sound surprised him with its smallness. The surgeon stepped in later with a mouthguard smile that did not quite cover the intensity in his eyes. The man listened as he learned that the procedure had not matched expectations, that inside his neck there had been a structure the team did not recognize, that they had removed all visible material and that he would stay overnight for observation. He nodded and kept nodding, as if he could agree his way back to certainty. The waiting began. He learned the rhythms of the ward, the dawn vitals with their beep and hush, the way coffee carts sounded like relief even when he had no appetite, the particular gravity in the footsteps of physicians who carried news. He slept in shallow bays, dreamed of clear water and a net sinking in it, woke to the same phrase compressing his thoughts. During the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch. Those words had become the axis of his days. In the lab, a pathologist examined the samples with the patience of someone reading a palimpsest. The first impression under low magnification showed fibrous tissue latticed with small cystic spaces, some of them containing translucent membranes. At higher magnification, she saw structures suggestive of larval segments, a ghost of anatomy, delicate hooks faint at the edges like old ink. She closed her eyes and reopened them, checked the slide label, then the requisition. She called in a colleague. They reviewed photographs from literature seldom pulled from their shelves. They conferred with infectious disease. They considered contamination artifact misreading. Later, the lab confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection, recorded only a handful of times worldwide. The name they used had the sober cadence of Latin and the shadow of places where waters were still and certain creatures cycled through hosts with millennia of practice. They spoke it quietly, aware of what a word could do to a life. He heard the name and felt the floor stay where it was, but tilt slightly, as if the hospital itself had taken a breath. The infectious disease physician sat at the edge of his bed and laid out what the team knew. The parasite, in its larval stage, had lodged under the skin and constructed the scaffold they had seen. The surgery had removed the visible structure. Medications would target any microscopic remnants. No evidence suggested the brain or organs had involvement. The case would be studied because it taught, because a handful of times worldwide meant every detail mattered. Fortunately, the patient recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment. He swallowed the first tablets with the reverence of someone accepting a truce. The case became a striking reminder to both doctors and patients that even a small, seemingly harmless bump should never be ignored. The story did not end at discharge. He returned home to a chair that remembered his shape, to a kettle that clicked when done. The bandage on his neck became smaller by the day until it hid under the back collar of his shirt. His phone filled with messages from friends circling the subject, trying to land on tone, shock wrapped in jokes, worry camouflaged as trivia. He stood in the bathroom at night and tilted his head to catch the light, tracing the line the surgeon had made, thin and clean, already quieting to a pale seam. He avoided mirrors in the morning because they made him think of the operating room, the way time had folded in there. He found himself collecting moments that had led him here. A lunch at a street market where he had taken a skewered fish and watched steam curl into the cold air. A week in a rural cabin where the water ran from a pump that had sounded sturdy but coughed sometimes. A habit of swimming in a canal to wake himself up in midsummer when the city had felt heavy and airless. He was not superstitious, but he had a collector's eye for clues now, a need to sketch a map backward. He brought these details to the follow-up appointment, and watched the doctor sift through them with scientific caution. It might have been any of those. It might have been none. The team's care extended beyond the incision. He sat in a small room with a research coordinator who asked if he would consent to his case being anonymized and submitted to a journal. He read the document twice, recognizing himself in every line even when he was reduced to age and gender and city. He said yes because the story he had fallen into was no longer just his. He returned to work with a scarf because the HVAC at the office had a way of blowing cold air at his neck. He caught his reflection in the elevator glass and saw someone who had been surprised by his own body and then stitched back together by a roomful of strangers who moved like family when someone's skin opened. Some nights he woke with a sensation he struggled to name, not pain exactly, but an echo of the ache that had begun the whole thing. He would press his fingertips against the healed edge and feel only the plain miracle of skin. He would remember the way the surgeon had said unexpected structure unlike anything they had encountered before, The way the nurse had documented every step, the way the pathologist had let Latin do the heavy lifting. He would sit in the dark kitchen, drink water, and take the next tablet from the blister as instructed, the targeted treatment marking his calendar with small acts of obedience. His mother called more often and told him stories set in kitchens and markets and summers from his childhood he barely remembered. She had a way of circling toward the subject of illness as if she could coax it into gentleness. He listened and allowed the sound of her voice to file down the edges of the memory. He met a friend for a slow walk in the park and found himself talking about minor details from the operating room, the way the surgical lights looked like moons, the clean gravity of a drape being lifted, the surprise of hearing the word rare applied to his own anatomy. The friend nodded and then said quietly that ignoring small things had been his own habit too, and that this story of a lump becoming a lesson had entered his head like weather. Weeks stacked into a season. The follow-up imaging showed nothing worrisome. The blood work returned to a normal that the infectious disease team could have framed. He took the last tablet of his course and placed the empty blister in the trash with a small ceremony that no one saw. He kept the clinic's card on his refrigerator with the corners curling inward like petals. When he reached for milk in the morning, he saw the number and felt a restraint braided with gratitude, restraint against the desire to pretend nothing had happened, gratitude for the fact that something had happened and he had been met with steady hands. He attended a case conference as a guest at the invitation of the attending who had first examined him. He sat at the back while slides glowed at the front of the room. The images showed the ultrasound with its storm shadows, the intraoperative photographs where pale latticework gleamed like frost. A resident spoke with a voice that treated each fact as a stepping stone over a river. The attending described how the mass had reacted strangely to touch, how a routine plan had flipped into caution without panic, how documentation had become duty because a handful of times worldwide meant you cataloged everything. He watched physicians take notes. He watched them lean forward. He saw himself become a case, a story with educational value, and he felt a human mixture of pride and displacement. He left the hospital that day with sunlight on the back of his neck. A breeze braided itself around the lower leaves of the plane trees along the road. He walked slowly, not out of fatigue but in deference to the line his days had taken. He passed a cafe, and the clink of cups felt like punctuation in a paragraph that had refused to end too soon. He remembered how for months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. He remembered how over time a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. He remembered how gradually the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable. Until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. He carried these sentences like stones warmed by the sun, turned them in his pocket, learned their weight until they felt like a kind of faith. At home, he wrote down what he could recall: faces, words, the feeling of the operating room freezing as the unexpected structure announced its presence under light and steel. He wrote the names of the nurses because names were the way gratitude learned to speak. He wrote the way the pathologist had pressed a slide under the microscope, paused, and then reached for a book that smelled like dust and knowledge. He wrote that the lab confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection, recorded only a handful of times worldwide, and that the confirmation did not frighten him so much as it threaded him into a lineage of other patients, anonymous but real, each of them a lesson for someone who would come later. He did not become a spokesperson for vigilance, but he found himself telling a story when the topic drifted toward aches and bumps, and the ways bodies whispered before they shouted. He spoke about the dull ache, the occasional itch, the way a small swelling could be dismissed, and how a physician's careful eye could change the plot. He spoke about how a minor surgical procedure had been scheduled, thought to be routine, and how, when the first incision was made, the room had held its breath. He spoke about the care and the documentation, the hours of delicate work, and how fortunately the patient recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment. When he reached this point, he would stop and look at the person listening and see something settling in their eyes, a note written to themselves, the kind that changed behavior later without fanfare. He slept better. The scar faded the way a shoreline softened in distance. He found himself less hurried. He said yes to a trip he had postponed. He sat on a train and watched farms turn into towns and then into the idea of a city. He rested his head on the window and felt the small tug where once there had been an ache. The window glass trembled with the tracks, and he felt not fragile but threaded to something that tolerated breakage and repair with equal composure. In the spring follow-up, the surgeon greeted him like a friend. They reviewed the arc of events without rushing. The physician noticed the mass had been unusual. The reaction under touch had been the first sign. The operating room had frozen at that sight. The team had proceeded with care. The lab had found the rare diagnosis. The treatment had done its work. The surgeon asked if he had any questions, and he found that he did not in the interrogative sense. He had only the broader, quieter question that followed him since the first stitch: how to live in a body that could surprise you and still be your home. He stood, shook the surgeon's hand, and felt a gratitude that did not ask for words. He walked out into a day that bore no marks of hospitals. Street vendors set up their barrows with an economy of motion, apples stacking into minor architectures. A child tugged at a parent's sleeve and pointed at a dog as if it were the first dog in the world. He reached for the back of his neck without thinking, touched skin that had healed into a fine line, and smiled at the ordinary joy of that. The case lived on in a journal and in the minds of the team who had learned from it. It lived on in him, too, not as a threat but as a story with weight and light, a story that had folded him into a quiet fraternity of people who had not ignored the next small sign after all. In the evening he brewed tea and sat by the window as the city drew its curtains. He took the last of the notes he had made and slipped them into a drawer he rarely opened. He did not need the words any more to remind himself, but he wanted them kept, the way people kept stones from a beach, not for value but for texture. He watched the street lamps wake one by one and did not think about endings. He thought about the steadiness that had carried him from a dull ache to clean skin, about the fact that a team had worked with extreme care, documenting every step, and that in a lab somewhere a slide rested in a file with a label in neat handwriting. He sat there until the tea cooled and the window gave back only his reflection and the faint suggestion of a scar that had started as a whisper and had become, finally, a quiet line telling him he had been repaired. He carried the hospital's language with him like a pocket guide, and in quiet moments he unfolded it and read it again. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. Those sentences had become a refrain he recited without trying, the same way people hummed the first lines of a song without noticing. He repeated them when he scheduled follow-ups, when he answered messages from distant relatives who had heard a fragment of the story and wanted more. He set the kettle on and let the burner tick its way toward heat, and he let the timeline speak. Gradually the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable, until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. During the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch. A minor surgical procedure was scheduled, thought to be routine. But when the first incision was made, the operating room had frozen. The unexpected structure had written a new chapter under his skin. He met the infectious disease physician again 2 weeks after finishing the first phase of treatment. The office looked out over the roofline of a neighboring building where pigeons had learned the timetable of the cafeteria below. The physician brought a folder with printouts, photos, a diagram of the parasite's life cycle sketched on a page with arrows and modest circles. It did not feel like a lecture. It felt like being invited into a mystery that had already resolved its climax and now offered context. The parasite had belonged to a tiny fraternity of organisms that passed through hosts with a stubborn logic. People, in rare cases, had served as wrong addresses on an ancient mail route. His case had been one of those detours. An epidemiology nurse sat in on the visit. She asked about springs and canals, about fish markets and country trips, about pets and their deworming schedules. He described the rural cabin, the hand pump, the canal swims, the skewered fish eaten in the thrum of a market where smoke and laughter drifted like weather. She took notes in neat rows. She did not hunt for blame, she hunted for pattern. It helped our understanding, she said as she capped her pen. It helped us make sense of how a handful of times worldwide became this time, here. He returned to work with an ease that surprised him. His colleagues had cleared his inbox, and his chair welcomed the shape of his back. He caught himself rolling his shoulders less, because the dull ache no longer sat there like a coin beneath skin. He booked his meetings with gentle margins, a courtesy to himself he had not learned before. On lunch breaks he walked by the canal he had once used as a cold baptism for summer's heavy air. He stopped at the railing and watched the surface for signs, ripples around drifting leaves, the tug of current around a pilaster. He did not condemn the water. He simply recognized it as a place where a microscopic story might have brushed his life. On a Sunday he visited his mother with a basket of groceries and the calm of someone who had learned new speeds. She served him soup that tasted like memory, and seasoned it with stories he had forgotten he knew. She touched the back of his neck as mothers did, pulling back the collar to see the tidy scar. It healed well, she said, and she did not say the rest out loud, that she had woken in the night picturing the operating room freezing as the unexpected structure rose into view, that she had listened to the phone at strange hours as if phones could breathe. He sat with her until the streetlights blinked on and then walked home through a neighborhood that smelled of laundry and bread. The hospital contacted him about a patient panel, a small gathering arranged for residents and nurses where patients recounted their experiences. He agreed, not because he sought a stage but because the story asked to be useful. On the day, he sat in a semicircle of chairs alongside a woman who had survived sepsis and a man who had navigated a rare autoimmune storm. He spoke without theatrics. He described how for months he had felt that dull ache and occasional itch, how he had dismissed it as muscle tension, how over time the swelling had grown, how he had ignored it, convinced it had been nothing. He described the ultrasound storm cloud images, the surgeon's pause, the first incision, and the way the operating room had gone quiet as if even the machines had leaned in to listen. He described the team's careful work, the documentation, the samples collected for testing, and how the lab had confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection recorded only a handful of times worldwide. He said, "Fortunately, I recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment." And he watched the room tilt toward that word, fortunately, as if it were a bench they all shared for a minute. Afterward, a resident approached him with questions that came out like gratitude. "I felt the moment in your story when routine vanished," she said. "I want to be good at that moment." He nodded and remembered the surgeon's hands, the way caution and confidence had braided without friction. He said, "They named what they didn't know, and then they did the next right thing." The resident wrote that down as if it were a lab value. An email arrived from the pathologist who had recognized the larval structures. She invited him to visit the lab if he wished to see his slides, anonymized and mounted in a tray that now sat in a drawer labeled with a case number. He went. The lab smelled faintly of xylene and paper. She showed him the pale ovals of tissue, the latticed architecture under the scope. He looked, not because he understood the histology, but because he wanted to meet the thing that had shared his skin like a quiet tenant. Under magnification he saw the ghosted suggestion of hooks, the delicate, disciplined geometry that had once held him in a pattern he did not feel until too late. He felt no horror, only a precise, cooler awe at the world's intricate insistences. He began to notice how bodies spoke in other people's lives. A friend complained of a persistent cough and a fatigue that refused to be shrugged off. He did not diagnose, he drove him to a clinic. Another friend had a mole that had grown suspicious while nobody watched. He offered to sit in the waiting room while the dermatologist traced its history. He did not become a preacher. He became a presence. The journal published the case with images and a measured narrative. His name did not appear, his story did. He printed a copy and slid it into the same drawer that held his notes, between a manual for a kitchen appliance and a taped envelope of childhood photos. He liked that it lived with the ordinary things. He liked that his extraordinary detour had returned him to ordinary rooms. The epidemiology nurse called with a small coda. Another case in another city had surfaced, similar features, another handful in the worldwide count. She sounded interested, not alarmed. she said. Your case helped us recognize theirs earlier. And he stood by the window and listened to pigeons argue on the sill and felt the odd warmth of connection to someone he would never meet. He thought again of the river of cases running through hospitals, and how some of them braided briefly and then separated, a pattern both humbling and kind. He took up swimming again, but he chose a pool whose water spoke the language of chlorine and lap lines. He learned the discipline of breath, the way water pressed a hand to his back and asked for rhythm. He counted his strokes and felt the scar at his neck shift under muscle like a seam that had learned to lie flat. When he lifted himself out of the water and sat on the edge, small droplets stood at the line of his hair and fell in a measured drip, a punctuation he did not rush. A letter arrived from the hospital, printed on heavy paper with a crest. It thanked him for participating in teaching sessions, for consenting to his anonymized case, for allowing his rare detour to become a lantern for trainees. He put the letter beside the clinic card on the refrigerator. The corners lifted as weeks passed, and then settled again. He made a grocery list around them and made dinner with the letter still visible. He ate slowly, not because he had become careful about everything, but because he enjoyed the taste of ordinary food that carried no question marks. In late summer, he met the surgeon at a cafe near the hospital. The man ordered black coffee and a slice of something with apricots and almond dust. They spoke about weather and books and then about the day of surgery in a way that had become even and almost companionable. The surgeon said, "I still see that moment when we found the lattice." The man said, "I still hear the quiet when you did." They sat without needing to add more. A resident walked by and nodded to the surgeon with the respectful speed of someone keeping appointments. The surgeon nodded back and turned to the man. "We do not always get endings this clean," he said. The man looked at the scar's suggestion under his collar and agreed. Clean had not meant simple. Clean had meant careful hands, good timing, patience, and luck that did not brag. He walked home by the canal, the one he now watched like a monument. The surface reflected a sky broken into pages by wind. Cyclists skimmed along the path with the unconscious grace of people whose bodies worked. He felt no need to narrate anything out loud. He let the past line up inside him in the order it had occurred. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. Gradually the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable, until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. During the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch. A minor surgical procedure was scheduled, thought to be routine. But when the first incision was made, the entire operating room froze. Beneath the skin lay an unexpected structure unlike anything they had encountered before. The team worked with extreme care, documenting every step. After hours of delicate work, they successfully cleaned the wound and collected samples for testing. Later, the lab confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection, recorded only a handful of times worldwide. Fortunately, the patient recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment. The case became a reminder, yes, but also a bridge. It carried him quietly from carelessness to attention, from assumption to curiosity, from ignoring a whisper to hearing it and answering. He returned to his apartment at dusk. He switched on a lamp and its light pooled in the same corners as always. He folded a towel, rinsed a glass, opened a window to let in evening air that smelled of rain far away. He felt the day shift onto its second page. He did not perform gratitude like a task. He let it sit on the table with the salt, small and ordinary. Somewhere in a drawer at the hospital, a slide with his tissue waited for another pair of eyes. Somewhere in another city, a patient he would never know touched the back of his neck and decided to get it checked sooner rather than later. He sat, listened to the room's quiet, and let the story rest without ending. He kept small rituals that anchored the days, and within those rituals the old refrain threaded itself with new meaning. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. He brewed coffee and watched the bloom in the press like a storm forming and dissolving in miniature. He tied his shoes with a care he never granted the task before. He left his apartment a few minutes earlier than he used to, as if punctuality could be a tribute to the luck that had held. On a Wednesday, he received a message from the hospital's media office. A health program wanted to feature rare cases with educational value, and his anonymized story had drawn interest. The request came with soft edges, no names, no identifiable details, only the anatomy of what had occurred and why the teaching mattered. He hesitated and then agreed, not to chase attention, but to make the next patient's path shorter. The filming took place in a quiet room with neutral walls and a window that turned the afternoon sun into an instrument. He sat with a clinician who guided the conversation. He spoke in the same steady past tense that had become his shelter. He described how gradually the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable, until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. He described how during the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch, and how the minor surgical procedure had been scheduled as routine. He described the pause at the first incision, the way the operating room had frozen when the unexpected structure shone under the lights. He spoke about meticulous documentation, hours of delicate work, samples gathered for testing, and how the lab later confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection recorded only a handful of times worldwide. He said, as he always did, that fortunately he recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment. The producer thanked him, and the clinician squeezed his shoulder with a wordless kindness that had weight. A week later, the infectious disease team invited him to a morbidity and mortality review, not because something had gone wrong, but because the case had asked everyone to sharpen their craft. The room held a long table, water carafes, notepads, and a hush that respected both outcomes and effort. The attending walked through the timeline, showing the ultrasound images and the operative photos. A resident presented a brief literature review, her voice steady as she named papers that lived in journals few clinicians met in their ordinary weeks. The pathologist spoke again, this time with side-by-side images that made the diagnosis legible even to lay eyes. The pale lattice, the faint segmentations, the ghosted hooks. A slide showed a map with dots where similar cases had appeared across decades, a constellation sparse enough to feel personal. When questions opened, the room's tone stayed generous. People asked not how anyone could have missed it at first, but how they had recognized the moment when routine ended and care became choreography. He listened and recognized in their questions the same vow he had made silently in recovery, to answer whispers before they became shouts. After the meeting, the epidemiology nurse handed him a short survey for long-term follow-up. It asked about fatigue, appetite, sleep, mood, and any unusual sensations near the scar. He checked the boxes with the precision of someone who respected forms now. Under other, he wrote that some evenings brought a slight echo where the ache had once lived, not painful, merely a reminder, like a tide tapping the shore. He added that walking helped, and swimming, and the small courage of telling someone else to see a doctor sooner. He began returning to places that had once formed a loose perimeter around his life. The market with the skewered fish smelled of smoke and salt. The man at the grill recognized him and lifted 2 fingers in a salute that belonged to a city's language more than to any grammar. He bought oranges and felt their weight in his hands, bright and definite. He avoided the canal's edge on certain days, not out of fear, but out of respect for his own weather. On other days he stood above the water and let memory pass through him without lodging. A neighbor who rarely spoke knocked on his door with a problem that had nothing to do with medicine. Her old radio had seized into static. He took it apart on his kitchen table, wiped dust from the dial, reseated a loose connection, and listened as music returned in a thin but honest stream. She sat while he worked and talked about her brother, who had delayed a visit to a clinic for a nagging pain until the day he could not climb the stairs without stopping to breathe. She said she did not scold him because people were complicated. He nodded, and when the radio sang, they both smiled like conspirators in a minor heist. In late autumn he traveled to see a friend in a smaller town where nights fell earlier and stars behaved as if the city did not exist. They walked along a path lined with birches that held their pale bark like letters. He told the story the way he had told it in the hospital rooms, with the sentences he trusted. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time, a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. He did not dramatize. He let the facts carry their own voltage. His friend listened and then told him about the summer his sister had found a lump and had gone in the next day, how early had made all the difference, how luck and timing and attention had braided themselves into outcome. They stood quietly after that, not because silence was required, but because the conversation had reached a place where talking would be a kind of stepping on grass that asked to be left unflattened. The targeted treatment ended months earlier, but he kept the habit of taking a pill with water at the same time every night, replacing the act with a vitamin not because he believed in it, but because rituals left empty hollows if abandoned all at once. He slept through the night more often. He dreamed of corridors that opened into gardens. In the mornings he touched the back of his neck and found only the seam of light his skin had become, the memory folded into it like a fine thread. He learned to say no to late meetings that squeezed his evenings into corners. He learned to say yes to breakfasts that once felt indulgent. A message from the journal arrived with a small request to use one of the operative photographs for a lecture abroad. He pictured a room in another language where a slide would glow, where someone would point to a lattice beneath skin and talk about rare parasites and common lessons. He granted permission and returned to his day. The idea that his tissue had become a quiet envoy made him smile without irony. At his next checkup, the surgeon palpated the area with the familiar gentle pressure and then stepped back. "No masses, no tenderness," he said, and the line felt like a poem someone had trimmed to essentials. They reviewed the same mark, the unusual shape, the strange reaction to touch, the frozen room, the careful work, the lab's confirmation, the targeted treatment, the steady recovery. Repetition did not dull it. Repetition set it like a bone. The surgeon asked if he had any lingering worries. He said only that sometimes he felt an ache's memory the way people felt weather in old injuries. The surgeon nodded. "Bodies keep records," he said, "and sometimes they read them aloud." The winter came in mild, with rain that misted rather than hammered. He walked anyway, umbrella over his shoulder like a flag of truce. The city carried on, buses exhaled, storefronts rearranged their small dramas. A violinist made a corner ring with a tune that belonged to no one person. He stopped at a bookstore and bought a used paperback with someone else's underlining in it. At home, he found a page where a previous reader had drawn a small star beside a sentence about paying attention. He closed the book and laughed softly, not at coincidence, but at the way the world sometimes stacked meanings until they resembled intention. A cousin called from another country to ask about a persistent rash that had resisted creams and compliance. He listened, asked questions that physicians had asked him, and ended with the same gentle sentence. "See someone?" The cousin promised he would. They talked about football and weather and the price of fruit, the way families padded worry with ordinary cloth. He sat one evening with his notebook and tried to reconstruct the first day he had noticed the itch. The details refused to line up. Dates blurred, and the order of small events betrayed him. He wrote instead what had stayed true, that he had dismissed it as muscle tension, that a swelling had grown, that he had ignored it, that the doctor had noticed the unusual shape and the strange reaction to touch, that the ore had gone still, that careful hands had worked, that a lab had named the rare thing, that he had recovered and taken the targeted treatment, that the case had become a reminder not to ignore the ordinary when it spoke in a different tone. He closed the notebook and felt no frustration at the gaps. He felt gratitude for the spine of the story holding even as details shifted. Spring hinted at itself in the way trees powdered their branches with green dust. He stood again by the pool, toes on the wet tile, and slid into water that accepted him without questions. He swam steady lengths and counted quietly, not to compete with anything, but to keep his mind from slipping into the noisy corners. When he floated on his back, fluorescent lights arranged themselves like constellations he did not need to name. He looked up, let his ears fill, and listened to the underwater drum of his own body, fierce and reliable. On the way home, he passed the hospital and glanced at its windows. Somewhere inside, a team gathered around an image or a body, naming what they knew and honoring what they did not. Somewhere else, a patient lay under a light and felt time become elastic while strangers worked. He thought of how the team had worked with extreme care, documenting every step, and how those steps had built a bridge for him to walk back across. He walked on, hands in his pockets, the scar at his neck warm under his collar, the story open and patient, refusing any final period he did not place. He stood at the kitchen counter with the window open and let the cool air pass through the apartment as if it had been another kind of medicine. The habit of recounting the map of events lived with him in a calm, constant way. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time, a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. Gradually, the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable, until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. During the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch. A minor surgical procedure was scheduled, thought to be routine. But when the first incision was made, the entire operating room froze. Beneath the skin lay an unexpected structure unlike anything they had encountered before. The team worked with extreme care, documenting every step. After hours of delicate work, they successfully cleaned the wound and collected samples for testing. Later, the lab confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection, recorded only a handful of times worldwide. Fortunately, the patient recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment. He repeated this spine of sentences the way a violinist tunes strings, not to perform, but to check alignment with what mattered. A small envelope from the hospital arrived with a simple card inside. It contained copies of 2 images from the operative record, printed without identifiers, edges rounded as if to soften their subject. He set them on the table, beside a bowl of fruit and the folded morning paper. He looked at the pale lattice that had once occupied the terrain beneath his skin. It looked almost delicate when flattened on paper, the way a web under frost looked decorative until you remembered it had been built for work. He slid the images into a folder and felt a respectful distance settle over the memory. One afternoon he attended a community health talk at the library, an event stitched together by a nurse he recognized from the ward. The room smelled faintly of dust and glue, and the chairs squeaked in harmony. A family sat in the front row with 2 school-aged children who asked questions with the brisk curiosity that did not wait for permission. He listened as the nurse spoke about listening to bodies without panic, about going in early, about the kindness embedded in checkups. When the Q&A opened, he stood and told his story in the plain language he trusted. He did not show the images. He described the dull ache, the growing swelling, the dismissals, the unusual shape, the frozen room, the careful work, the rare diagnosis, the targeted treatment. The children stared as if he had mentioned a secret passage in an ordinary house. An older man in the back raised a hand and said he had a lump behind his knee that he had called nothing for 6 months. People chuckled gently. The nurse wrote down a referral. He sat again and felt the room tilt in a quiet, useful way. The epidemiology nurse reached out with a new request later that week. A graduate student had chosen to write a thesis on rare helminth infections in urban settings and needed to interview patients anonymously. He agreed and met the student in a university office that smelled faintly of old journals and coffee. The student had careful, open questions and a notebook with neat squares of handwriting. He asked about emotion, not only event. He asked about the morning after discharge and the weeks of treatment, and the way friends had tried to help. He asked what had changed and what had not. The man answered and watched the student's eyes sharpen at the places where medicine and ordinary life braided. The student thanked him with a seriousness that felt older than his face. He left and walked past a museum gallery with a small exhibit on parasites behind glass, the curated forms rendered in models that were almost pretty. He stopped and read the placards. The words talked about life cycles the way maps talked about roads. He smiled at the irony of learning this vocabulary after the fact and moved on. A month brought a minor scare. He woke with a tiny fullness along the jawline, a superficial node raised like a punctuation mark. It sparked an old reflex. He called the clinic instead of inventing comfort. The physician examined him and found no mass, no concerning signs, just a transient response to a mild throat infection he had ignored the way people ignored small weather. He took the prescribed course for the infection, and the node softened back into anonymity. He realized that attention did not mean fear. It meant the decency of checking the door when a knock sounded. He visited his mother again and found her reading on the balcony, a blanket over her knees. She asked about the checkup, and he told her the exact sentences the doctor had used. She nodded and told him about her morning, about bread she had baked and a neighbor whose hip hurt and would not be looked at. He offered to drive the neighbor. They went together the next day, and he sat in a waiting room that hummed with soft human static. He watched faces. He noticed how hands rested over pockets that held phones, and how eyes tracked the doors that opened to names. The neighbor emerged with a plan and a relief that made her stand taller. He returned to the pool and found a lane at a time of day when the water lay quiet and slow. He swam without counting for a few laps, and then counted to 10 and back down again. His neck moved through the water with a comfort that once felt foreign. He dressed, hair damp under his cap, and saw in the locker room mirror the line of his scar, pale and even. He pressed it lightly and felt only skin, no heat, no ache. He thought again how bodies kept records and how some lines read like kindness after a while. The journal article circulated among clinicians and found its way into a small online forum where patients shared rare stories. He read a few entries and then clicked away. He respected their experiences, but he guarded his own from becoming a currency in a place not meant for him. Instead, he wrote a single email to the pathologist with a simple line: "Thank you for naming what I carried." The reply came with the restraint of professionals who knew how to hold gratitude without letting it spill. She wrote that naming had felt like witnessing, that each case taught her how to keep looking when things looked ordinary. He started volunteering once a month at a free clinic, not as medical staff but as a helper who checked people in and brought water and held the kind of conversations that made waiting rooms less sharp. He learned to pronounce names with care. He learned 3 words in 2 languages that meant, "Right this way." He watched a physician kneel to look a child in the eyes and explain an inhaler without condescension. He watched a man unwrap a bandage from an ankle and wince, and then relax as a nurse cleaned and redressed the wound with competence that felt like light. When he spoke to the clinic coordinator about why he had come, he found himself repeating the litany with a gentler cadence. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time, a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. Gradually, the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable, until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. During the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch. A minor surgical procedure was scheduled, thought to be routine. But when the first incision was made, the entire operating room froze. Beneath the skin lay an unexpected structure unlike anything they had encountered before. The team worked with extreme care, documenting every step. After hours of delicate work, they successfully cleaned the wound and collected samples for testing. Later, the lab confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection, recorded only a handful of times worldwide. Fortunately, the patient recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment. The coordinator listened as if the words were a map pinned on a wall between 2 thumbtacks labeled before and after. Spring advanced. He took a train to the countryside where fields lay squared and green and the air smelled like rain braided with soil. He met the friend from the smaller town at a reservoir that held its surface like an unbroken thought. They rented a rowboat from a man who kept a jar of coins and an honest face. They rowed slowly, not toward any destination, but for the kind of motion that let minds wander without drifting into worry. He told his friend about the graduate student, the library talk, the clinic. His friend told him about his own small victories: a repaired fence, a repaired argument, a repaired sleep pattern after months of early waking. Repair had become a word they both held with care. Back in the city, he received a message from a medical school asking if he would participate in a standardized patient exercise, not with simulated symptoms, but with a real narrative for communication training. He agreed and sat in a room where a series of students practiced listening without rushing, speaking without hedging, and making space for the unknown without letting it grow teeth. He told them the same story each time and watched as each student learned to sit still in the places where silence should stand unbothered. One student, at the end, asked what sentence had helped him most during the worst hour. He remembered the surgeon's quiet admission of surprise and the immediate pivot into steady action. He said, "They said we don't know yet, but we're going to take care of this step by step, and we did most of the work." The student wrote it down in a notebook that already contained other sentences that would one day turn into practice. He visited the market again in early summer. The fishmonger handed him a skewer wrapped in paper, and he ate standing up, careful about the source, amused at his own caution, grateful for it too. He bought herbs in a pot instead of cut sprigs and placed them on his kitchen sill, where they found light and behaved like small, manageable life. He watered them with the precision he once granted pills and smiled at the continuity of care across wildly different subjects. When a neighbor's cat produced a series of unwell signs, he offered to drive them both to a veterinary clinic. He sat in another waiting room with another set of posters on another set of walls and petted the cat through the bars with 2 fingers. The vet explained a parasite common to cats that city people often forgot existed. He nodded and watched the neighbor listen closely. He felt the echo of recognition at the way knowledge walked in and reorganized the day. He kept a habit of writing a line each night, not always about his neck, sometimes about a leaf that had spun in a breeze like a coin, sometimes about a sentence in a book, sometimes about the way a barista had handed him a cup with his name spelled right. The scar changed slowly, as scars did, the color turning from a faint rose to a quiet ivory that matched his skin. He stopped noticing it until he needed to remember, and then touched it lightly, not to check, but to honor. During a follow-up at the hospital, the attending asked if he would speak to a patient who had received a frightening but preliminary result, someone at the midpoint between fear and clarity. He agreed and sat with the person in a small side room where the muted television whispered unrelated weather. He did not offer advice. He offered presence. He recited the lines he trusted, not as a prediction, but as a testament to the way care could look. He said that a room could freeze and then thaw into action, that a team could document every step with hands that did not tremble, that a lab could give a name to what hid in tissue, that targeted treatment could do its work with quiet efficiency, that recovery could arrive like a neighbor knocking softly instead of a parade. The person exhaled in a way that sounded like a page turning. He left the hospital into a late afternoon that hummed with the ordinary. Buses sighed, a distant siren braided with a bicycle bell, and the bakery on the corner released a tide of warm air and cinnamon. He walked home through it all, a man with a story that had already taught him what he needed, a man who had felt for months a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck and had dismissed it as simple muscle tension, a man who had watched a small swelling appear and had ignored it, convinced it had been nothing serious. A man who had later sat under lights while an unexpected structure folded open beneath his skin, and a team had worked with extreme care, documenting every step, and later a lab had confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection recorded only a handful of times worldwide, and fortunately he had recovered well after surgery and had begun a course of targeted treatment, and all of it had stood not as a dark banner, but as a lamp he could carry without burning his hands. He climbed his stairs, opened his door, and let the day go on, unhurried, unfinished, quietly bright where it needed to be. He woke on a Saturday with a clear list and an uncluttered mind. Outside, the morning thinned into sunshine, and the city lifted itself into weekend tempo. He brewed coffee and opened the window, letting the air settle over the kitchen like a quiet promise. Habit made him trace the line at the back of his neck with 2 fingers, a small, pale seam, then drop his hand and smile at the ordinary confidence of healed skin. For months, the man felt a dull ache and occasional itch on the back of his neck, dismissing it as simple muscle tension. Over time a small swelling appeared, but he ignored it, convinced it was nothing serious. Gradually the lump grew larger and more uncomfortable, until he finally went to see a doctor, expecting an ordinary cyst. During the examination, the physician noticed the mass had an unusual shape and reacted strangely to touch. A minor surgical procedure was scheduled, thought to be routine. But when the first incision was made, the entire operating room froze. Beneath the skin lay an unexpected structure unlike anything they had encountered before. The team worked with extreme care, documenting every step. After hours of delicate work, they successfully cleaned the wound and collected samples for testing. Later, the lab confirmed an extraordinarily rare parasitic infection, recorded only a handful of times worldwide. Fortunately, the patient recovered well after surgery and began a course of targeted treatment. The sentences no longer felt like a warning, they read like a charter, how attention and steady hands converted fear into outcome. He had one last appointment on the calendar, a final follow-up that would close the chart with a line any patient wanted to hear. He took the tram, watched the city pass in frames, the florist arranging cut stems like arguments that ended kindly. The bakery door opening and exhaling sweetness, a child pressing a forehead to glass and fighting a circle to make a moon. He stepped into the hospital lobby and knew its acoustics by heart, the measured hush that even families learn to respect. The surgeon greeted him in a room with soft light and the familiar topography of diagrams on the walls. The exam had the quiet efficiency of a well-practiced ritual: glove snap, gentle pressure around the scar, a nod that carried more meaning than the syllables that followed. "No masses, no tenderness, full range," the surgeon said, and the words landed like keys set carefully back on a table. They reviewed the arc one last time, not because they had forgotten, but because the telling made order out of what the body had once tried to hide. He asked the questions he had saved: whether he needed long-term medication, whether the rare infection carried a shadow into the future, whether he should change the ordinary map of his days. The answers were specific and kind. No long-term therapy. No evidence of lingering involvement. Pay attention without fear. Come back if anything spoke in the wrong tone. They shook hands at the threshold, and the surgeon added the sentence that untied the last knot. "You did the most important thing," he said. "You came in." The man nodded, thinking of how thin that decision had felt at the time, an errand between emails, and how much of his life now hung from it like a bridge from a single anchor point. He left by a side stairwell and crossed the courtyard where the hospital kept a small garden for staff and patients who needed to move through living things between rooms. Lavender held its color like a held breath, and bees conducted their precise, unsentimental work. He sat on a bench and watched a woman in scrubs read a message, smile, and tuck her phone away. He felt the whole building around him, its rooms where people learned news they did not want and news that loosened the chest, its hallways where fear walked but did not always win, its quiet places like this where endings could soften. On the way home, he stopped at the library and returned a book he had kept too long. He wandered without intent down an aisle he rarely visited and found a thin volume of patient essays, small true stories written without flourish. He checked it out, slipped it into his bag, and carried on. At a crossing, he paused for a cyclist whose bell chimed like punctuation and then crossed into sunlight that felt new because he felt new inside it. That evening, the clinic coordinator called with a request that surprised him with how right it felt. A community health fair wanted a brief talk from someone who had navigated a rare diagnosis and come out the other side with clarity. He said yes before he had a reason not to. He drafted a page at the kitchen table, then crossed lines out until what remained looked like the body of the story itself. No decoration, just the pulse. The fair took place in a school gym that smelled faintly of varnished floor and paper. Tables lined the perimeter with pamphlets and bowls of fruit and blood pressure cuffs that hugged arms and reassured. He stood at a makeshift podium and looked at people who had come to barter an hour for a little more control over their lives. He spoke in the voice he had practiced in hospital rooms. He did not lift the rare diagnosis like a trophy. He set it gently down and spoke about the chain that mattered. For months he had felt a dull ache and occasional itch, and had dismissed it as muscle tension. A small swelling had appeared, he had ignored it, convinced it had been nothing serious. The physician had noticed what he had not: the unusual shape, the strange reaction to touch. Surgery had been scheduled as routine. The operating room had frozen when the unexpected structure revealed itself. The team had worked carefully, documenting every step. The lab had later confirmed a rare parasitic infection recorded only a handful of times worldwide. He had recovered, begun targeted treatment, returned to ordinary days. "I am not here to frighten you," he said. "I am here to tell you that ordinary attention is a kind of love. Don't ignore what asks to be heard." After the talk, people came with specifics that were not his to answer and with gratitude that was. He repeated the same sentence as a benediction. "See someone?" An older man showed him a note on his phone with a clinic's address already typed. They smiled like co-conspirators. A teenager asked whether he was scared to swim again. He said he trusted pools and he trusted water and he trusted himself to make choices he could live with. The teenager nodded with a seriousness that belonged to the young and brave. He walked home at dusk while the city staged its small theater, windows lighting up one by one, the sound of cutlery beginning its nightly music, footsteps assuming the pace of evening. He made pasta with herbs from the sill and ate with the windows open, the night air drafting through like a kind guest. He placed his journal on the table and wrote the last entry he owed this particular story. He did not aim for poetry. He aimed for accuracy and mercy. "I carried a whisper on the back of my neck and called it nothing," he wrote. It asked louder. A doctor listened. A room stilled and then moved with purpose. Hands worked and named what hid. I healed. Now I listen sooner. That is the change. He closed the notebook and slid it into the drawer where he kept the printed article and the rounded-edge photos from the operation, tucked between spare batteries and a ruler, because this was not a shrine but a file among the business of living. He washed the dishes and left them to dry on a towel, each thing in its place. He poured hot water over tea and stood by the window while steam lifted like a quiet prayer without words. A message arrived from the graduate student. The thesis had been submitted, accepted, and would become a paper. "Your clarity helped me write clearly," it said. He answered with thanks and an uncomplicated happiness for someone else's ending. He set an alarm for the morning, not because he needed it, but because he liked the small sound of beginning. He turned up the lights, and the apartment drew itself down to shadow and outline. In bed, he lay on his side without flinching at the memory of what had once lived beneath his skin. He touched the back of his neck a final time, then let his hand fall to the sheet. The city quieted by degrees, each sound taking its leave. He thought of the hospital garden and the bees, of the tram windows, of the surgeon's last handshake, of the sentence that had tied everything together, "You came in," and he let that be the final truth. Even a small, seemingly harmless bump, even a dull ache that could be waved away, could carry a story that needed telling. His had been told. It had taught him the discipline of attention and the generosity of medicine. It had reminded him that ordinary life, held up to the light, was extraordinary enough. He slept, and the night kept its watch, and the scar on his neck kept its quiet line, neither a threat nor a trophy, simply a record that the body had once asked for help and had been answered.